Classification taxonomy is very similar to GCSE, as in we should know some of these things already, such as the idea that a species can produce live, fertile young. That's the definition of a species. Also, they should have physical similarities and biochemical ones. The other thing that's very important with defining a species as being able to be of the same thing is they must occupy the same area of the planet, the same ecological niche. There's no point them being able to produce live fertile young if one's at the top of a mountain and the other's at the bottom of the ocean and they never meet, unless there's some form of mass migration to the beaches. But in general, if they are the same species, by definition, they must give birth to live fertile offspring and be in the same area as each other. You've also got the genus name, which is the generic name. It's a little bit like a person's first name. The species name, the specific name, is like the last name, whereas the genus name is like the first name. So we've already encountered this at GCSE, so hopefully most of this is making sense. But if not, I'll recap it anyway. So moving on to those physical and biochemical similarities. As you can see here, we've got two different species. We've got the horse and the donkey, and they can be made to reproduce in captivity. It doesn't happen naturally, but it can be induced reproduction, and they'll give birth to a mule, which is similar features to both. So it's got the donkey-like ears, but it's got the strength and stamina more of the horse, sure-footedness of the donkey there. So they're very good sort of beasts of burden and stuff like that. However, they are 99.9% of the time infertile. There is a saying with the Romans, which is similar to our once in a blue moon. They used to say, when a mule foals. So it can happen very, very, very rarely. But in that case, the offspring of the mule will be infertile because of the compounding errors in genetic material. But it's easier just to go, they are infertile, simple as that, proving that horses and donkeys are separate species. However, there is other things we need to consider, and the key one is physical similarities. When you look at something, if they look the same, they probably are the same. But this caused a lot of problems. The Victorians were very good at going, well, that's a bluebird and that's a bluebird. They must be the same species. Whereas they didn't realize that one was found in Papua New Guinea and one was found in Australia. So it's very difficult to just say, because they look the same, they must be the same. But you can look for similarities, and that's a good indication of maybe they're the same species. Another thing is you can check biochemical. So if the hemoglobin is identical, that's a good indication. There's immunological. So antibodies from one organism work against antigens of another. So that would prove that they've got the same evolutionary roots, or they may well be the same species. The more of these you tick off, the closer you're getting to saying they're the same species. You've also got embryo similarities. And the last thing, like I've already said, is that ecological. They need to be in the same area. There's no point in them being on opposite sides of the world, unless, like I said, they do mass migration. That developmental similarities, the embryo similarities, are really quite interesting. What we've got here is you can see at the top, all the organisms are very similar in appearance. So they all look very similar. They've got the eye spot, the long sort of backbone tail, the little limb buds, little ear dot there. They all look very similar, but as they start to develop in the womb or in the egg, they will start to develop more features that define them into different categories. And what's really interesting about this is you've got the fish and the salamander, which are very close. And if you look developmentally, they look very similar most of the way through. Then you've got the tortoise and the chicken. They again are related species. Reptiles and birds are similar in their phylogenetic tree. So they're going to be related, distantly related, but they're still related. So you can see there's similarities there. And the last two, the calf, so cow and human, both mammals, both have got very similar developmental stages. It's a bit of a stylized picture, but hopefully you can see the similarities in development or the differences. You would say that the fish is completely different from the human, but the human and the calf, relatively similar because both mammalian, that sort of thing. So classification is kind of like a language. It's set in stone pretty much from Linnaeus. He was the first to develop it because he realized that there were so many different names for things because different languages. So he came up with the idea in 1753 and just went, let's have the same name for everything, because there is at least 10 million different species living now. and there's way more that are extinct. So we need to have a system that said, this is what we're talking about. Because if you just sort of went from French to English, for example, there'd be different names for cat, dog, etc., etc. So it's really good to have a naming system. And like I said, Linnaeus came up with it, and it consists of the two parts: the generic name, which has always got a capital, and then the specific name, which is lowercase. So the example I've got there is the lion, capital P, and then all lowercase, and the tiger, capital P, and then all lowercase. And because it's on the computer, I have put it into italics to show it and make it stand out. If you're handwriting it, you underline it. It's just a convention. It's like starting with a capital letter and finishing with a full stop. This is the convention for the naming of species. The reason we underline it is because some people's handwriting looks like italics. So it's good to make it stand out. So that's classification. And the other thing we need to look at is taxonomy. Now, taxonomy is basically a key. They are separate things that you can differentiate between. A bit like you might do with the class and go, do they have glasses or not? Do they have blonde hair or brown hair or black hair? So you can specify them into different categories, and they are non-overlapping. You can't, yes, sometimes I wear one glass, sometimes I don't, or sometimes I've got black hair, sometimes I've got blonde. Yes, I know you can dye it and stuff like that, but the baseline feature is either black hair or blonde hair. So it's a non-overlapping class system. And taxonomy is quite involved. As you can see, there's taxonomy of beer. It's one of the best ones I've actually found. So you can see that they're a beverage and they fall into two categories, fermented and unfermented. And then you can move through there into the different types of beers in this case. So taxonomy is similar organisms grouped together in non-overlapping categories. And there's two types of taxonomy. There's artificial, which means basically they look similar. So the example being an insect and a bird wing do the same thing. They both allow flight, but they're completely different in origin. But better is the natural classification, which is based on evolutionary routes. We used to do it artificial. So, oh, they can fly, they must be the same thing. We now look at the evolutionary history and see how they're adapted to their function. So the bird's wing, the human arm, and say a bat's wing have all got very similar roots. So they've got same ancestral roots. And the last bit here is really important. Hierarchy comes up quite a bit in exams, and it basically is composite groups with no overlap. Like I said, you've either got glasses, you haven't. You can either fly or you can't. You've got 6 legs or 4 legs, etc. So it's a definite non-overlapping system. So what I've drawn here to try and represent this natural versus artificial classification is if we look at the insect wing, I know it looks like a leaf, but I'm not the best drawer, and the bat wing here, you can see they're both wings. I've put the red lines on there to represent the membranous nature of the wing. They both would be classed as flying. So if our artificial classification was flying, the insect and the bat would be lumped into the same category because they can both fly. Whereas if we go for the natural classification system, hopefully you can see between the bat wing, the human hand here, there's very similar features. They've got elongated fingers, they've got the thumb there, and they've even got the bones in the hand, either physically here or physically at the sort of wrist joint to some extent where the hand would be for the bat wing, because it is a modified front limb. And even the horse's hoof has similar bone structure to the human hand. So these three, we would say, are more closely related to the insect wing, which is way further back in sort of evolutionary history than any of the other three here. The interesting thing about the horse's hoof is they actually walk on their thumb. What happens is the fingers fuse and fold inwards, and the thumb folds up and across, and the thumbnail is actually the hoof. So it is actually, again, a forelimb. It was splayed at one point. It had 5 toes, and they fused over time to become cloven, like a pig's trotter. And then over time, that fused together and became a single large thumbnail, which the horse then walks on. So hopefully you can see that natural classification shows these three very similar in evolutionary history, whereas the insect wing, way separate from the other three. But if we put it into artificial, we'd just go, well, they both fly, so they must be in the same category. And that's kind of wrong. So just to sort of specify that again, you've got analogous and homologous, and they are pretty much exactly the same as we just talked about. We call it now more artificial and natural, but they have similar function but different in origin, fly wing versus bird wing or bat wing, and then different in function but similar in origin, such as the bird or bat wing and the arm of the human. So you've got different ways of sort of specifying it. Moving on from that, we've got the classification system that we need to know, and humans are a really good example. We are animals, no matter how much we try and mask it, we are animals. And of that, we have backbones. We produce milk covered in fur and give birth to live young, so that classes as mammals. We are of primate descent, and we are the branch of the great apes, which is the Hominidae. So that's orangutans, chimpanzees, gorillas, that sort of thing. Moving on from that, we are Homo, as in of human, and then sapien, as in wise or thinking. So we are Homo sapiens, so that's our classification. You see how I've put that in italics, capital H, lowercase s. So this classification system, hopefully you've got a good idea of already, but if not, I've done a quick recap here. The smallest group is species. Well, really before that, there's a subspecies, which is another branch of it, but the smallest category is species. Moving up from there, you've got genus, family, order, class, phyla or phylum, kingdom, and then domain. There's also life, but that's pretty much, is it alive or is it a rock, for example? So that's going from smallest to biggest, but often we go from biggest to smallest. So I'll give you an example of the great white shark here. We start with the kingdom at the top and work our way down. A good way of remembering it, I've always sort of learned this from when I was told, is you've got Kim puts cushions on fluffy green sofas. It's a good way of remembering it. Come up with your own, please do. You know, it worked for me, but you make up your own. And that helps you to remember the order, because often in exams, they do ask for the order or which one's missing or what comes next. And as we move up from the species towards kingdom, there is more animals, more creatures, more plants available. So we increase in the number of species. And as we move down the scale, we have an increase in the similarity. They start to look the same. So you can see that here with the grizzly bear through to the sea star, it's called a starfish, all the way down through the phylum, we get rid of the sea star. It's got a backbone, so all those organisms have a backbone. Then mammalian, the snake is not a mammal, it's a reptile, so that goes. The squirrel is not a carnivore, so that goes. The fox is not a bear, or of bear descent, so that goes. The panda is not a true bear, it's a bear with delusions of vegetarianism, so that goes. So we're left with the two main bears there, the grizzly and the black. So can you see how they've become very similar in appearance, but the number of organisms has reduced?